Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is the sword sent to me for review from Kataku Budo some time ago. I did an unboxing and initial impressions video on this sword. I will put a link to that in the description down below. I had also planned and mentioned in that video that I want to do a destructive test. So this video was supposed to be a comprehensive destructive review, all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to do that because it's cold as balls outside, even though balls are nature's hand warmer. It's really, really cold outside, and I don't want to, I'm pointing to a window if you can't see that. I am not going to do the destructive test right now because I don't have a safe space to do that indoors right now. And I know some of you have been waiting to hear about this sword and my thoughts on it, so I thought I would get this out. Depending on when you watch this video, there may be a destructive test. If there is, I will put a link to it in the description down below so that you can find that video if you are so inclined to look at it. Anyway, it's not happening yet. I need some warmer weather, and I don't necessarily mind the cold myself. It is in the like -10s and such outside at the moment, but it's not that I necessarily mind doing it out there. I'm just concerned that I might lose chunks of it in the snow and not be able to find them to show you. Also, I don't know how the negative temperatures might impact the use of the sword, and most people aren't swinging swords at shit in -10. So anyway, that's the reason why this video is not a destructive test, and I'm going to go on with some other disclaimers. Again, note this sword was sent to me from Kataku Budo for the purposes of review. It's a $150-ish sword, so my thoughts in this video are going to be as I compare it in my mind, my personal thoughts against other $150-ish or low-budget swords, as it were. This was a custom iteration. The look and feel of the sword is basically my doing. I picked these colors, I picked these fittings, though I think they're pretty representative of the other offerings they might have. Also note, this sword now has been used, so as you see video footage, the sword blade has rusted slightly. I tried sharpening the edge up here. This kind of lower portion is semi-preserved to the way it came originally, but the blade doesn't have necessarily a whole lot of visual features to share with you, so I don't know that that's necessarily pertinent to the review or not. Anyway, know those things. Also, lastly, as I say so often, I'm not an expert in these things. This is a mass reproduction sword, and I am a dingle fritz giving my thoughts and ramblings on it, so take what I say with a grain of salt. Hopefully the video and the photos and all of that help you decide if this thing is worth your money or not. That's all I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to change hearts and minds and such, so just, again, take what I say with a grain of salt. Hopefully the photos help you, and video, because this is a video. Anyway, on with the video. As I so often do, I will start with the Kashira, and you can see it's got my favorite little pattern of swirly mitsudomes on it. Now this is a, well, it's pretty rough, honestly. It has some character in that it's got a symbol or a moan on it that I like, but it's a little, well, it's just not that well done. So a more worthy comparison, this is the Kashira from a Hanwei Wind and Thunder, I believe, and so you can see that they are slightly different shapes and slightly different sizes, but you can see the casting quality on another mass production sword, which is granted much more expensive. But this is what I mean by good casting. This is still a cast fitting here. It's nothing overly special, just made by a company that's known to do casting quite well, and you can see it just has a little more dimension and texture, and the lines are a little crisper, and the shape is a little more defined. And it doesn't necessarily have the same kind of just overly shiny whatever coating this happens to have on it. The Hanwei fittings will wear and all of that kind of stuff. This will likely wear a little bit more quickly, at least that's what I would speculate. Anyway, you can see two different contrasting Kashira. So when I say that these are muddy and not terribly crisp and clean, I'm maybe comparing it to something like the Hanwei cast fittings when I say that. So from the side, you can see there's no transition here that would bite your fingers. The ito is overlapping slightly. There's no shitodome cast or otherwise on the Kashira, and I can kind of it looks like a relatively big hole here, but the shape is nice and it's comfortable enough. Nothing bites my hand when I move it around, and overall it's a reasonably comfortable user piece. The knot is not terribly tight. You can see it moves around under some degree of pressure, and the ito has a kind of synthetic chintzy, cheapy kind of feel to it, but it has a nice purple color. Underneath, you can see that there is black Samegawa. These are small nodules, nothing overly expensive, but it does look like it's real Samegawa rather than some sort of plastic imitation. And the ito is loose in some spots, tight in others, but I would certainly call it serviceably comfortable and perfectly tight. It hasn't loosened up, and obviously you'll be able to see when I used it. I've played around with it in different environments for the last couple months, and it really, it's not showing a lot of wear or usage. The diamonds have different shapes and sizes. I wouldn't say they're even or consistent, but again, the Ito is serviceably tight in most of the spots. I haven't encountered any issues. The Manuki don't move around. They're reasonably well placed. I have 2 pegs in the sword. I haven't taken the handle off at this time, so I don't know how easy it comes off or not, but I will do that in a moment. Having taken out the Nakago, I can share a couple thoughts. So the Nakago is what you would expect for a sword in this price point, actually maybe a little cleaner than what you might expect. It doesn't have any dimension character. There's no signatures or discernible marks on it of any kind. But, it's clean and reasonably well shaped. One thing I do find somewhat surprising is that the Hamachi and Moonmachi, while these are not what I would call examples of good, they are at least on the same plane, which is not something I conventionally see. A lot of times they're a little bit further off. But you can see there's some rough bits of grinding and tool marks and things like that, some rough spots. Again, for a sword of this price point, this would be actually pretty good. The Fuchi is basically shares the same type of issue as the other piece does. It's muddy in comparison. There is a ledge here, but none of the edges are sharp, and from a user standpoint, I didn't notice really any discomfort. The shape of this ska is comfortable in my hand, and despite the ledges and otherwise protruding parts, I didn't experience any discomfort. Again, for the sake of comparison, here is a similarly modeled Fuchi from the Hanwei iteration, and it just gives you some contrast. So when I say things are muddy and not crisp, the Hanwei is perhaps a better example of something that thematically is going after the same type of thing. The other bit to note here is just how off-center this is. You can see that the Fuchi area here is pretty much right on this line, and then it overlaps by a 1/4 inch on this one. It doesn't rest, the Nakago doesn't rest it doesn't rest in a way that is pleasing to the eye. Functional maybe, but not necessarily pleasing. From a user perspective, I didn't necessarily have any problems doing any Iaido or playing around with the sword. It seems to go back in and out just fine, but that transition is off-putting to the eye. While I have it here, you can see that it also binds ever so slightly right about yay. So it's not just the Habaki that's too tight, it's binding somewhat in the saya. But honestly, from a user perspective, this was not uncomfortable either. Even in the cold weather, it moves in and out, and it'll probably slide a little easier over time. I've used this again for a couple months, and it has loosened up some since I've had it, but it kind of par for the course that it'll loosen up further. One other bit worthy of note while I have the handle off is that it's not cracked. There's no crack in the wood. This is post-use and dull thuds into tatami mat. This is not just after shipping. I've done some cutting and some usage and all of that, and it's gone through my really cold weather and back in my house and all of that, and it's still not cracked. So for the money, it's at least worth noting that what I have received is not cracked and damaged. Now, obviously, you would hope it wouldn't be cracked and damaged, but you might be surprised the number of relatively inexpensive swords, or even really expensive swords, that come with the core of the ska damaged right out of the box. Now, very commonly, the swords are mass-produced, so they're not making them in the way that's traditional, where this particular ska is fit on that particular tang, and it doesn't often work that way. They might be made completely separately, and at the end of the day, banged on with a rubber mallet, and that can oftentimes cause some cracking. So either manufacturers in general are getting much better at this, or maybe Kataku Budo is doing something special. Though I would venture a guess it might be a little bit more luck than anything else, given how it's assembled and how the transitions may work. But nevertheless, I do have to tip my hat to the fact that this is not broken. Again, you'd hope it wouldn't be. You'd expect it not to be, but very often it is, and they didn't miss that part. The Tsuba is, I think, a little cleaner than the Fuchikashira, but not by a grand amount. Now, I picked this up mostly because this was the Fuchikashira that had the symbol that I liked, but I don't know that I would have necessarily chosen this Tsuba to pair them with. It's nice enough, and it has some silver and gold and things like that, but again, things are a little bit muddy. The reverse side has some other stuff going on. Again, similarly, just muddy, not not terribly crisp and clean. But again, for $150 sword, it at least has some character and, you know, maybe some attempt to tell a story. I don't know what that story would be, other than sort of the mitsudomes are cool. I'll talk about the saya for a moment here. Now you can see there are little mitsudomoe that going through the kurikata, this little nubbin that protrudes here. They come out, they're very often not glued in, so when you actually untie the sageo from the display knot that it comes with, if you intend on using it, this happens and you end up just taking them out. I guess people like to have them, but this is more of an annoyance to me. The sageo is of a reasonable quality. It came in a nice, clean, tight presentation knot that was better tied than the ito itself here. One thing I want to note as a point of, well, just a little bit of disappointment. These are not quite the same color, and depending on the light, this lighter purple certainly comes through. I had hoped that the purple here and the purple here would match, but they are a slightly different color. You can see they're somewhat close, but if I change my light color around and make it slightly different, you might be able to notice a little more some of the color contrast, depending on I guess how you're watching it, but they're not quite the same. The other bit to note is this kind of gold bit on the saya. It doesn't have a very strong transition. I think it's a very handsome piece on the saya, this two-tone saya with the golden bit up here. Now, I had a lot of trouble identifying from the website how this would look, and I had hoped that these golden bits here or on the Tsuba, this kind of gold here would match here, but neither one really does, and I would have liked that to match. Honestly, the color contrast has grown on me over time, and I start to like it a little bit more, but that's because I love swords, even the Ago ones. So the point is, though, that I had intended that this purple matched the sageo, and then this gold matched this gold. It did not, and so that may be a source of disappointment. Just know that the colors between the parts might not match, so if you were thinking about maybe trying a deeper contrast, I think aesthetically it probably would have looked better if I chose a different color than a purple sageo, and if I maybe went with a different color than gold, having picked a fitting set that also had gold in it, it probably would have worked better if I had added more colors rather than tried to match and had two different tones of purple and two different kind of tones of gold. Anyway, those are aesthetic blah-bitty-blah things, and I don't know that they necessarily matter. There's a deep piano black. You can probably see that this is pretty reasonable and well done. There's some imperfections in the paint, but they are minor and tough to see if my camera will participate with me. Overall, I would say this is really a pretty good looking little saya for, again, $150 sword. One note of dissatisfaction on the paint is this area where the kurikata meets. Now, some of these are a little rough around the kurikata, but I would just say that I can make out kind of wood splinters and such around the kurikata, which is less than ideal. Just want to show you the koiguchi area. This is far from bad for a sword of its price point. Obviously, it could be better. It could be completely a horn koiguchi with the wood imparted right and all of that. But for what I see, there's no chunks of residue and glops and goop and stuff like that. And it does have some sort of surround here, and the wood is reasonably well done. Anyway, it's not good. It's not a good koiguchi, but for a sword of this price point, it is quite good. Hopefully that makes some sense. I would not say this is the example of what you want to achieve if you were to do a custom multi-$1,000 project, but for $150, this is a good koiguchi. On to the part most people care about, and that is the sword. So you can notice after some cutting and sharpening, which is what I've done, I tried to put this edge on, and I suck at that, so know that. Anyway, you can see that there are some rough spots that have formed. I wiped it off with a rag and cleaned it off with a bit of oil, but I haven't polished it yet. I will try that in just a moment. Anyway, you can see the roughness from my sharpening, and you can make out the spots from the rust. Now, this happened actually pretty quickly. I was cutting some water bottles and some other bottles that may have contained some various aesthetic stuff that could etch a sword pretty quickly, and this sword did rust relatively quickly. So just know you want to clean it, and if you're going to do some joyous water bottle cutting in the backyard, things that are acidic will leave you with this. Anyway, polish-wise, there's not really much to say in polishing. There's an attempt at a Kissaki with a Yakote here. It's kind of a mooncast shadow of what it really should be, but it's reasonable enough for the money. At least they are in the same spot, and it's reasonably well shaped. It doesn't jut off in any odd directions. The bohi terminate in approximately the same place on this area, which is nice. There's a little bit of deviation, but not a huge amount. The blade is nimble and nice enough. These scratches are, from me, it was not terribly sharp when I got it. I mean, sufficiently, but if you're cutting used Japanese tatami mats, which is what I was doing, then the level of sharpness that it had on it would be what I would call insufficient for that task. But water bottle cut, depending on what you're cutting, the edge may or may not be sufficient for you. This is a little closer to look to the way it came out of the box, and you can see that this is I believe a 9260. I can't remember what steel it is, but there's not necessarily a ton to see here. It's not folded steel. The effect that you may see on a hamon is I don't think intentional. It's not supposed to be differentially hardened, from my understanding. It's supposed to be a through hardened piece. You can make out in polish wise some tool marks and some scuffing that came on the sword. It was not a show piece, at least that's not the intention that struck me, given that I saw imperfections, blemishes, especially in the bohi area. There's a reasonable amount of tool marks in the polish. So anyway, you can almost make out like a saguha hamon or some after effect of a hamon. It almost looks like this was differentially hardened, but I could swear that was not the intention, but depending on the light, it almost seems to come through here. Anyway, it didn't seem to bend or anything as far as I could tell. Also note that this came with a bedazzled habaki, something with a little bit of a design on it, which is nice. I probably should have mentioned that in the earlier habaki section, but it's mostly the plain brass habaki that you see on every sword, but this one at least you can get a few different options for mones or other decorations or adornments on the habaki. Now I've also applied some Flint's metal polish, and I have cleaned up the rust spots. So just a quick application, and this is kind of the result. You can still see some spotting from the rust in the right light, but realistically they've really cleaned up, and they're a lot harder to discern in anything but the right light. So it almost looks like you can still make them out here, but a little bit further back, and maybe you won't see them. And now I can still see them really clearly. Whoo, that 4K camera, right? Anyway, I did apply some metal polish, and they no longer stand out, at least to my eye, as giant red spots, though I can make them out, obviously, with the right light. Now I'll tell you a little bit about my experience moving it around. So this $450 sword, it's comfortable. It's a little tip heavy for a sword of its size, and for how long and how much it weighs, it's a little bit more on the tip heavy side than I suppose I'd like, but honestly that's not necessarily a bad thing. Some people like it, and it provides a comfortable experience. I didn't have really any issues moving it around in terms of doing EI with it. It was comfortable enough to draw, despite the odd transitions and kind of not lining up and somewhat cheap saya. It did not necessarily give me any gripes to speak of. It wasn't the most comfortable thing. I could kind of tell when it started to bind near the habaki area, but you can kind of move past that, and it loosened up over time. Because it's not terribly heavy, for me anyway, I'm a larger man, it is comfortable enough to move. I could do it for an hour or so, but it's not as light as any Ito. So if you're comparing and contrasting this, if you, for example, are looking, maybe I should get this sword, or look for any Ito from Japan, from say Tazando or something, this is probably going to be less expensive than that option. In most cases it seems to be, but the Ito, many of them from the various vendors out in Japan, would give a superior experience to do Ito with. Also, they tend to sound a little different moving it around. Anyway, moving it around, I would say for a $150 sword, this is pretty reasonable, pretty comfortable. I really have no gripes. That said, it didn't wow me, but I'm not really expecting to be wowed in this price category. The fact that it didn't disappoint me or give me really anything to bitch about, I suppose, is a victory unto itself. So in terms of cutting, there's the my attempt at sharpening with this sword. I started out cutting used Japanese tatami mats, and I will say it moved through used Japanese tatami mats. Now bear in mind when I say used tatami mats, these are Japanese tatami mats that were used as flooring in Japan, and then somehow they ended up in my garage where I'm cutting them. The point is that they are a little bit rougher to cut than, say, new Japanese tatami mats, or mats that are used specifically for the intention of cutting, which are known to be a little easier, or say beach mats. Those are known to be a little easier target than the used flooring, which may have oils from feet and spills and things like that. Sometimes there's variation in how sometimes they can be like concrete and sometimes they can be a little lighter than that. But anyway, the point is that they are known to be a little more arduous to cut than some other forms of tatami mat. So the point is that it moved through those, which is good. I wouldn't say it was easy. The sword had to be swung pretty hard, or at least that's what I started out doing, but it moved through the targets. Water bottles, it cut through water bottles, but I wouldn't say it did particularly well. The edge wasn't refined where cutting an empty bottle was something that resulted in anything other than the bottle flying away. When I sharpened it, it certainly improved, and it moved through the mats a little bit easier. It took a little less gusto, but I still had to really push the sword. It wasn't going to do any of the work for me, and that's something I suppose I would register as a complaint. This could be sharper coming out of the box. My attempt at sharpening did aid it, but suffice to say, I still wasn't terribly impressed. Though, no, I suck at sharpening. If you have an aptitude for that kind of thing, chances are it's going to work out a little bit better than what I did, given that I know I'm shit at it. Just as a point of reference as well, I have basically a much more expensive sword. It's a Motohara blade specifically for cutting Japanese tatami mat, a light mat cutter that I also used on the same day, and you can contrast me using a much more expensive sword. Now when I say much more expensive, it's like a $2,000 sword, and this is a $150 sword, so it is not a fair comparison. But just as a contrast, when you see something that's a little more purpose-built for cutting tatami mats against something like this in the same hands, it might give you a point of reference. Anyway, suffice to say, I wasn't terribly impressed. In a couple swings when my friends cut with the sword, that was met with a dull thud, and it's not going to do the work for you as some other swords where you kind of throw it out there and it moves to the target. It requires a little bit more attention to get a keen edge on it, and even then I wouldn't say it was fantastic, but for a sword of its size, it's sufficient. Now, before I do destruction testing, I'm going to give you my thoughts as it is right now. Before I've done any of that, I've done kind of what the sword should do, and I can give you my thoughts as it stands to the experiences I've had thus far. So in this time frame where I haven't beaten the crap out of it, I would say that this is a pretty decent sword. It doesn't necessarily wow me though. At $150, I like that it gave me some option in customization. I got to have a hand in picking some of how it looked, and that isn't something that every manufacturer gives you. But there are manufacturers that do. That said, the experience of getting this and how it came out, I would say I enjoyed, even though it didn't come out exactly the way I would like. The sword is also pretty good at what it did for the money. It didn't impress me the same way, say, the Practical XL did at cutting tatami mats, but while that sword is better at cutting specifically tatami mats, it comes at the detriment of all the other bits that you might want to use the sword for. If you wanted to do exclusively EI, well, even a cheap iteration from Tazando, well, it may be a little bit more expensive than this. Still, I would say would provide a superior experience specifically at doing Iaido, but you're not going to cut anything with it. If you want a reasonably kind of well-balanced sword that seems durable, to its credit, this sword had some dull thuds against used Japanese tatami mats, which are pretty rough. It may or may not have been whacked into the floor by my friend who was also cutting with me at the time, and it held up. It's not bent, it's not twisted. There are no issues to speak of on the sword, with the exception of it didn't really come sharp enough. That was about the only thing that required my personal interaction. Outside of that, there are issues, as I've noted, with the sword, but for $150, what can you expect? It certainly lines up with the other iterations from Ronin or Musashi in terms of how it worked out. Though this one does seem to have a couple more minor things that are off, but it also gives a couple extra features. The steel used in this is supposed to be a little bit more expensive than some of the offerings that are out there from other companies. So deal-wise, I think it presents a great value, and that's what I would say thus far. Anyway, more to come in the destruction test. Hopefully by the time you watch this, it's out. If not, then I don't know, keep pestering me until it is, but I'll put a link to that video in the description down below. Anyway, that's all I've got. I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.